Good morning, Eastside, and anybody else joining in. I hope that you had a good week, and I'm excited to share with you yet another message. Eastside, I'm super excited to be coming back to be in person with y'all. We've been online for a while now, and I'm excited to see all of your faces once again up in Kansas City. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Around 47 years ago, on October 30th, 1974, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman squared off in the boxing ring. Ali had dubbed it the Rumble in the Jungle, and Foreman was heavily favored. He was considered to be the hardest puncher in heavyweight history. Foreman was fairly confident he could finish off this upstart, Muhammad Ali. And when he entered the ring, he intended to do everything within his power to squash Muhammad Ali. Ali, however, did something in that fight that no other fighter had ever tried before. In a technique he called the rope-a-dope, Muhammad Ali held up his arms against his face and leaned back against the ropes, allowing Foreman to punch away at him for 8 rounds. The strongest boxer, maybe in the history of the sport, beat on Ali until he could punch no more. He punched himself out. When the right moment came, Ali bounced off the ropes and knocked out Foreman, sending him into retirement, literally. George Foreman believed in himself. He was a confident boxer who delivered some of the hardest, most powerful blows any fighter has ever done in the ring, has ever delivered in the ring. Yet, he lost. And not only did he lose, he suffered a blow in the ring which he never really quite recovered from. This fight literally sent him into retirement. 2,000 years ago, there was another confident man, a fighter, a brute man who feared nothing and no one. And if there was any conflict, you could count on him being there, especially if the conflict involved endangered friends, and especially if that friend happened to be Jesus Christ. This guy's name was Peter. People of today might have called him something like Rocky, for that's pretty much what his name meant. And like his name, he was a rock of loyalty and courage and strength, a man who decided to stand beside Jesus in some of the worst situations. And for the most part, Peter did stand beside Jesus. His loyalty to Christ caused him to be a model of true faith and devotion. It was Peter who stepped out of the boat and walked on the water out to Jesus. And say what you will about the fact that he took his eyes off of Jesus and began to watch the waves and feel the violent wind. He took his eyes off of Jesus and became overwhelmed by fear and doubt, and he began to sink. Then Jesus reached down to him and rebuked him for his lack of faith. So say what you will about that incident. Peter was the only one of the 12 who even dared to try, because he loved and trusted Jesus, and he wanted to be with his master even in the most impossible of situations. It was Peter who answered Jesus' question when he asked who the disciple said he was. And Peter blurted out, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Some might say, well, yeah, but a few minutes later he said something really embarrassing and that caused Jesus to rebuke him. Well, that's true. But Peter was the only one of the 12 who even had the courage to say what they all believed anyway. Whenever there was something to do, something to say, something to stand for, Peter was there. You could count on him. Peter was simple, uncomplicated man who had one driving passion, his love for Jesus and his determination to defend his master against all threats. That's why he reacted so violently to Jesus' comment in Matthew 16:21 through 23. Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life again." So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And later, when Jesus was about to be betrayed by Judas in the garden, he says, "You will all fall away." Jesus told them, "For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." So Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you will yourself disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. Mark 16:27 through 31. Then here in Luke, we read that Peter told Jesus, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." That's the kind of friend that I want to have. I have some great friends. There aren't many who, when the going gets tough and your back is against the wall, who will stand for you. There are many times I wished I had guys like Peter watching my back. That's what you would call a ride or die friend. Peter was willing to step into the ring and take on all comers for the sake of Jesus. And I believe he would have tried to take on the entire Roman army if it came down to it. Even now, Peter believed he could defend Jesus against any and every threat. But he wasn't going to be able to. You see, Jesus knew something about the coming fight that Peter did not. Peter was going to try and fight a fight he in no way could possibly win. Look at Luke 22, verses 32 through 33. "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." In other words, Peter, you're not going to win this one. You will turn away, you will fail, your faith will falter, and you're going to hit the mat hard. But I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray that you don't stay down for the full count. And when you get back up, I'm going to pray for you to strengthen your brothers as well. Now, the fact that Jesus had warned Peter he would fail did not stop Peter from trying. You remember in the garden when Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Remember the man cutting off the ear of the servant of the high priest? That was Peter. John 18:10 tells us, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus." And even after Jesus was arrested, Peter still doesn't give up. Luke 22, verse 54 tells us that when the crowd seized Jesus, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. He's upset and he's frustrated and he's perhaps a little fearful that this whole thing has gotten out of hand. But he was still seeking an opportunity to protect his master. He was still hoping to defend Jesus even if he didn't want to be defended. He follows, trying to stay close to Jesus, hoping to, well, we don't really know what he hoped. We don't really know that he even had a plan. All we know is that he sat down by the fire and he waited for his chance to do something. The Gospel of Mark gives us this account. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself by the fire, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them. You were a Galilean." He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man that you are talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and he wept. Mark 14:66 through 72. Peter denies Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times, just like Jesus said he would. 3 times Peter says, "I don't know Jesus." He even cussed a little to prove his point that he was not a follower of Christ. But why? Why would Peter deny Jesus, his friend, who he was devoted to? We're not told, but one of my suspicions is that Peter feared that if he was recognized, then he would be arrested. If they arrested him, he couldn't do Jesus any good whatsoever. His usefulness to Jesus would end here in this courtyard. So he lied, and he cursed, and he denied he ever knew Jesus, doing everything humanly possible to be of use to Jesus. Then when he heard the rooster crow, he saw Jesus look directly at him. He went out and wept bitterly. He had done everything he knew how to do to protect Jesus, and in the end, he failed. Now, there are 2 things I want you to see here. First, Peter lost his fight and betrayed his master for one very basic reason. He wanted to protect Jesus, but he wanted to do it his way. Even when Jesus told him how things were going to turn out, Peter refused to accept it. He even had the audacity to rebuke Jesus. When Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life, Peter took him aside and tried to rebuke him. Peter's plan was to improve on God's plan by doing what came naturally to him, which was violence and anger. Later, when the crowd came to the garden to arrest Jesus, Peter acts true to form. He took out his sword and he started swinging, cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And the way Peter has got it figured, if you hurt Jesus, I'm going to hurt you. And Peter wasn't the only one that thought like this. Luke 9 tells us the story of James and John, who were outraged when a Samaritan town rejected Jesus. James and John then asked Jesus to bring down fire out of heaven and destroy that town. But he turned and Jesus rebuked them and said, "You know not what manner of spirit you are of." Luke 9:55. You see, the problem for James and John, and for Peter as well, was that they forget who they were. They forget who they belonged to. They forgot that this wasn't how Jesus did things. They were used to the idea that if somebody hurt Jesus, they were going to hurt them. And are we any different? If someone attacks our Jesus, attacks our faith, attacks our church, don't we get angry and almost want to be violent? I don't know about you, but I felt that way in the past. I can remember when I was young in the faith on the school bus and somebody talked mess about my faith, about my dad and grandpa who are preachers. But we're called to be different, called to a different way of dealing with this world, because we belong to Jesus Christ. As Paul wrote, "Though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. That's a powerful verse. Why do we fight differently than the world does? Because our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's Ephesians 6:12. The reason Peter lost his fight that day was he forgot who he belonged to, and he tried to fight the battle his own way, doing everything humanly possible to defend Christ, rather than doing that which was divinely required. That's why he failed. And that's the first thing I want you to see. The second thing I want you to see is that in spite of the fact that Peter failed Jesus, his failure wasn't permanent. I believe Peter nearly gave up on following Jesus after that fateful night. I believe he had determined that Jesus could never trust him again. There's even a possibility that after Jesus raised from the dead, Peter had intended to maybe go back to fishing again, rather than embarrass Jesus ever again like that when he was standing by the fire that night. Part of the reason I believe that is found in John 21, where we're told of Peter sitting at another campfire with Jesus. At that other campfire in the high priest's courtyard, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. Now at this campfire, Jesus gives Peter 3 chances to tell him he loves him. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." At that first campfire, Peter had failed Jesus because he had tried to do things his own way, using his own plans in his own strength. And that might happen to you and me as well. There may come a time when we'll fail Jesus. We've done it already. Just like Peter did. We'll embarrass God so badly that we won't think that he'll ever forgive us again. That's when we need to realize that he forgave Peter, and that means he can forgive us too. Gary Enrig, in his book Hearts of Iron, Feet of Clay, tells the story of a very capable evangelist that God had used in a significant way in the British Isles. But he lost his interest in spiritual things. He drifted into a life of sin for a number of months. Some of his sin was done in secret, but ultimately it became public knowledge, and it even made the headlines. At first, all he could think of was that he had been ruined for life. But finally he realized what a fool he had been, and he came back to God, kind of like the story of the prodigal son. When he did that, he found exactly the same thing the prodigal did in that story. The Lord welcomed him back with open arms and began to strengthen and bless him. Finally, after a period of waiting and recovery, he felt pressed back into public ministry. But he was afraid that his sin would be found out and brought up all over again, and he'd be filled with shame. But after he felt sure it was hidden and tucked away in the past, he went back to preaching and rejoicing in the forgiveness of God. One night, when he was in Aberdeen, he was given a sealed letter. Just before the service began, he read this unsigned letter. It described a shameful series of events that he had engaged in, and his stomach churned as he read this letter. The letter said, "If you have the gall to preach tonight, I'll stand and I'll expose you." He took that letter and he went to his knees. A few minutes later, he was in the pulpit. He began his message by reading the letter from start to finish. Then he said, "I want to make it clear that this letter is perfectly true. I'm ashamed of what I've read and what I've done. I come tonight not as one who is perfect, but as one who is forgiven." And God used that letter and the rest of his ministry as a magnet to draw people to Jesus Christ. I love every one of you, and I hope this message was encouraging to you, and I hope you all have a great week. See you next time.